The night she was banished from his table, Eleanor did not weep. She stood in the corridor outside the great dining room of Ashmore Park, still wearing the pale blue gown she had dressed in with such careful hope. And she listened to the sound of crystal and silver and laughter floating through the carved oak doors. The Duke of Ashmore was entertaining. He had been entertaining all week, lords and members of Parliament, a countess with red hair and a voice like warm brandy, men who spoke of railways and legislation and the future of England. Eleanor had been introduced precisely once, at the beginning of the house party, with the flat brevity a man might use to indicate a piece of furniture. My wife. The Duchess. And then the conversation had moved on, as she had been expected to. But tonight, he had sent word through his butler, not even through his secretary, through his butler, that the Duchess would take her evening meal in her private rooms. The table was too small, apparently. The seating arrangement had been reconfigured. Her presence was not required. She had been a duchess for 4 months. She had been invisible for all of them. What no one knew, not the Duke, not his glittering guests, not even the stiff-backed butler who had delivered the message with such studied neutrality, was that Eleanor Ashmore had, in the 3 weeks since the guests began arriving, been slipping out through the servants' passage every morning before dawn. Walking a mile and a half through autumn mud to the nearest of the estate's tenant villages, and quietly, methodically, feeding people who were starving on her husband's land. What the Duke did not yet know would undo him entirely. The marriage had been arranged in May, during the kind of London season that smelled of roses and ambition in equal measure. Eleanor Whitmore was the second daughter of a baronet whose estates had been quietly drowning in debt for the better part of a decade. She had no great beauty, or so the gossips said, though those who looked carefully enough saw a quality about her face that was more lasting than prettiness, steadiness, intelligence. A mouth that curved with private amusement when the world was not watching. She was 24, which London considered nearly past hope, and she had long since released the expectation of a love match the way one releases a paper boat on a river, watching it go. Not chasing it. When the Duke of Ashmore's solicitor first called upon her father, Eleanor had sat in the corner of the drawing room and listened without expression while the terms were laid out. The Duke required a wife of good family and minimal complication. He was 32, recently returned from a period of extended travel on the continent, and disinclined to the prolonged theater of courtship. The Whitmore debt would be settled. Eleanor would receive a generous personal allowance. The union would be conducted with discretion and mutual respect. Mutual respect. She had turned those words over in her mind the whole carriage ride to Ashmore Park after the wedding. Sitting across from a man who had spoken perhaps 40 words to her across 3 brief meetings and who spent the journey reading correspondence with the focused silence of someone who had already concluded the most important business of the day. The Duke of Ashmore, Sebastian Cavendish, by his Christian name, though no one appeared to use it, was not unkind, exactly. He was precise. He was controlled with the particular thoroughness of a man who had learned that emotion was expensive and preferred not to spend it. He was handsome in the severe way of old portraits, dark-haired and gray-eyed and possessed of a stillness that could read as dignity or coldness depending on the quality of one's hope. He had shown her the house on the afternoon of their arrival with the efficiency of an estate agent. The principal rooms, the library, the gardens, the chapel. He had told her she might redecorate the private sitting room as she wished. He had told her Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, would see to whatever she needed. And then he had gone to his study and closed the door, and Eleanor had stood in the middle of a drawing room the size of her father's entire ground floor and understood, with the clear-eyed precision that was her particular gift, exactly what her position in this house was going to be. She was an arrangement. A requirement fulfilled. A duchess in name, in title, in the legal sense that satisfied solicitors and silenced gossip. She had begun, the very next morning, to observe. Not with bitterness. Eleanor had not arrived at Ashmore Park with a heart full of romantic longing that could be easily shattered. She had arrived with her eyes open and her mind working. And what she observed, over the first weeks of her marriage, was troubling in ways that had nothing to do with her husband's coldness. The house was in a peculiar kind of disrepair, not the dramatic ruin of outright poverty, but the slow, accumulated decay of neglect. Window frames swollen with damp. A kitchen garden choked with weeds. Servants who moved quietly and kept their eyes down with the careful minimalism of people who had learned that drawing attention to problems was its own kind of danger. And beyond the grounds, beyond the long avenue of oaks that bordered the estate, there were the tenant farms, a dozen of them, stretching across the valley. Their condition visible even from the upper windows of the house. Visible, that is, if one chose to look. Eleanor chose to look. She asked Mrs. Holt, carefully, about the tenants. Mrs. Holt had answered with the compressed loyalty of a woman who served the house before she served the truth. The tenants were managing. The harvest had been difficult. His Grace had not been in residence often enough to address certain matters. Eleanor had thanked her and said nothing further. But the next morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred, she had put on her plainest dress and her sturdiest boots, told no one, and walked out through the servants' passage into the grey September dawn. What she found in the village of Ashmore Crossing did not surprise her. It confirmed what she had already suspected from looking at it from above. It broke her heart anyway. The village had 11 families. 3 of them had not had bread in 4 days. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the first cottage she entered, invited in by a woman named Martha Croft, whose husband had broken his leg during the harvest and who had 3 children under the age of 7, and she looked at the near-empty larder and the thin faces and the careful, dignified way Martha Croft apologized for having nothing to offer her. A tenant's wife apologizing to the Duchess for not having food. Eleanor walked back to the house. She went to the kitchen. She spoke to the cook, a stout, wary woman named Agnes who had initially regarded her with the specific suspicion of a servant who has survived multiple mistresses, and she asked, with the direct courtesy that was her way, what stores the estate currently held. She asked which of the household budget remained unspent. She asked whether there was a wagon and a horse that could be made available 3 mornings a week. Agnes had stared at her for a long moment. Then she said, "There is, Your Grace." That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Eleanor rose at 5 each morning. She helped Agnes and 2 of the younger kitchen maids load a wagon with bread, dried beans, salt pork, potatoes, and, when the stores allowed it, preserved fruit and candles. She drove or walked alongside the wagon, refusing the coachman's insistence on accompanying her more often than not. As she found that the tenants spoke more freely when there was no livery visible, and she spent her mornings in the village, not distributing charity with the formal distance of a great lady, but working alongside the people. Helping to make repairs she could manage. Sitting with the sick. Learning names, learning histories, learning the particular texture of each family's trouble. She kept careful accounts. Every penny spent was recorded in a small leather book she carried in her coat pocket. She was not reckless. She had lived too long adjacent to debt to be reckless with money. She was also deeply aware that she had not asked her husband's permission. She had not asked because she had calculated, with the precision she brought to all practical matters, that the household budget contained sufficient slack to absorb these expenses without affecting the primary accounts, and that by the time anyone noticed and thought to object, the need would be too visible to dismiss. She had not anticipated that the need would become a source of genuine love. Because that was what had happened, in a way she had not expected and could not have engineered. The people of Ashmore Crossing had begun to know her. Martha Croft's eldest daughter, a serious child of 6 named Bessie, had taken to walking alongside Eleanor on her morning visits and solemnly reporting on who was feeling better and who was not. Old Thomas Hewen, who had farmed the southernmost field for 50 years and who had looked at Eleanor's first visit with the exhausted skepticism of a man who had been disappointed by the great house too many times to count, had last week pressed a small carved wooden robin into her hand without explanation and gone back inside without looking at her face. She kept the robin in her coat pocket alongside the accounts ledger. It was on the evening of the 4th week, the night of the dinner from which she was banished, that everything shifted. Eleanor had received the butler's message with a perfectly composed expression. She had thanked him. She had gone to her rooms. She had sat at her writing desk, opened the accounts book, and made her entry for the day's expenditure. Then she had put on her plainest dress again, not the blue gown, which she folded carefully and put away, eaten the tray of food that arrived from the kitchen with more appetite than she ever showed at formal meals, and gone to bed early. She had slept soundly. It was a small, private act of defiance that no one would ever know about, and it was entirely enough. October came in cold and serious, the kind of cold that meant business. With the guests gone, they had departed in a flurry of carriages and valedictions on a Tuesday morning, the red-haired countess last of all. With a lingering glance toward the Duke that Eleanor observed from an upper window with neither jealousy nor indifference, simply clarity, Eleanor turned her attention to the house itself. She began with the kitchen garden. She ordered it cleared and replanted with winter vegetables. Working alongside the two garden boys who had clearly never been asked to work beside a duchess and didn't quite know what to do with their hands. She had them repair the cold frames. She arranged for the excess from the kitchen stores, properly, this time, through a conversation with Mrs. Holt that was more a statement of intent than a request, to be preserved and allocated between the house and the village through the winter months. She turned, then, to the tenant leases. She found them in the estate office, which no one had apparently entered since the departure of the Duke's previous land agent 8 months prior. The records were in a state of disorganization that told its own story: rents collected inconsistently, repairs promised and not executed. A drainage issue in the North Fields that had been noted and filed without action for 3 consecutive years. She requested, through Mrs. Holt, access to the estate accounts. There was a pause of several days, presumably while Mrs. Holt determined whether this was proper, and possibly whether it was safe. Then the ledgers appeared on the estate office desk one morning, and Eleanor spent the better part of a week at that desk, cross-referencing, calculating, identifying where money had leaked and where basic reinvestment would recover far more than it cost. She was not an heiress. She had not been brought up to manage a great estate. But she had grown up in a house where money was always a source of anxiety, and she had watched her father's failures with the careful attention of someone determined not to repeat them. She had read. She had asked questions of people who knew more than she did. She had the particular intelligence of a person who understands that expertise is available to those willing to seek it, and dignity need not prevent the seeking. She wrote to a land agent in York, a recommendation from old Thomas Hewen, who knew of the man's reputation, and engaged him to come and walk the estate with her. She had not consulted the Duke. The Duke was in London, or so she understood from the brief note he had sent through his secretary informing her that his parliamentary duties would keep him occupied through the winter. He had asked that she not trouble the London house with correspondence unless it was urgent. She had filed this note with the others and gone back to work. By November, the Northfield drainage was under repair. By the first week of December, she had renegotiated 2 of the most burdensome tenant leases, not downward, in a way that reduced the estate's income, but restructured, so that labor contributions offset rent during recovery years. A model she had read about in an agricultural journal she'd found in the library and which the land agent from York had confirmed was sound practice. Ashmore Crossing began to change. Slowly, in the way that real change happens, not in dramatic declarations, but in small accumulations. More light in the cottages. Better fed children. Bessie Croft learning to read, because Eleanor had, quite without planning to, begun to teach her on the mornings when she visited. Old Thomas Hewen's field producing a winter crop where for years there had been only mud. Mrs. Holt, who had watched all of this with the increasing expression of a woman revising a firmly held opinion, came to Eleanor's private sitting room one December evening with a pot of tea she had made herself, not sent by a kitchen maid, made herself, and set it down on the table and said, very quietly, "The staff speak well of you, Your Grace. I thought you should know." Eleanor had looked at her steadily. "I am grateful for that, Mrs. Holt. And I am grateful for your patience with me these months." The housekeeper had nodded, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite tears, but was adjacent to them. She had picked up the empty tray and left without further ceremony. Eleanor poured her own tea and sat with it in the candlelight, listening to the wind against the windows, and felt, for the first time in months, something she recognized as peace. The Duke arrived on the 14th of December, unannounced. He had sent a letter, apparently. It had arrived the day after he did, a confusion of timing that the postal service offered no apology for, and which meant that Eleanor was in the kitchen yard, in her plain coat, with mud on her boots, directing the unloading of a delivery of grain that she had arranged from a supplier in the nearest market town, when the Duke's carriage came up the avenue. She heard it before she saw it. Turned, slowly. Watched it come. He stepped out with the composed authority of a man accustomed to arriving places and finding them in the condition he had left them. He looked toward the house, and then, finding her in the yard, he paused. A long pause. His gray eyes moved from her face to the grain sacks being unloaded, to the 2 farm boys she was directing, to the wagon, and back to her face. She did not rush toward him. She finished the instruction she had been in the middle of giving, that Stack needs to be in the dry store before nightfall, and then she walked across the yard to meet him. Her boots left prints in the December mud. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was even. "Your letter arrived this morning. I trust the journey was tolerable." He looked at her. It was the look of a man who had arrived expecting a specific thing and found a different thing in its place, and who was deciding how to account for the discrepancy. "The yard," he said finally. "You are managing grain delivery." The estate was running low. The winter stores were insufficient. She kept her tone purely informational. "I have been working with a land agent from York. I can show you the accounts if you would like to review them." He said nothing for a moment. She watched his expression with the careful neutrality she had practiced for months. Then, "Yes. I would like to review the accounts." "Of course. Mrs. Holt will have your rooms prepared. I suggest this evening, after you've rested from the journey." She nodded to him with the precise degree of courtesy appropriate between equals and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she did not look to see his expression. But she felt something shift in the air between them. The way one feels a change of weather before it is visible, something in the quality of attention he was paying to the space she had just occupied. Later, she would recognize it as the moment he first began to see her. The first week of his return was conducted in the manner of 2 people learning, very carefully, what the other had become. He reviewed the accounts. She sat across the desk in the estate office and answered his questions directly and without apology. He was a more thorough reader of numbers than she had expected, and she had expected thoroughness. He found nothing to criticize in the ledgers because there was nothing to criticize. This appeared to unsettle him more than a mistake would have done. He visited the tenant farms. She did not offer to accompany him, but he asked, in a way that was phrased as a statement, "You know the tenants better than I do." It was not quite an invitation. She accepted it as one. The first farm they visited was the Crofts'. Martha Croft opened the door and looked from the Duke, whom she had not seen in years, and who stood in his good coat at her threshold with the slightly rigid posture of a man facing a situation he has not prepared for, to Eleanor, who was already crouching down to meet Bessie Croft's eye and asking about the reading lesson. The cottage was warm. There was bread on the table. She could not see the Duke's face during this visit. She was not looking at it. But she was aware of the quality of his silence, which had changed from the silence of disinterest to something with more texture. On the walk back through the fields, he said, "How long has this been going on?" "Since September," she said. 3 mornings a week, initially. It has adjusted as needs have changed." He was quiet for a long time. The winter fields stretched around them, gray-brown, frost still glittering in the shadows where the thin sun had not reached. "The household budget," he said. "I worked within it. The accounts reflect every expenditure." A pause. "I was careful." "I have no doubt that you were." His voice was strange. She looked at him then, sideways, and found that he was looking at the fields, not at her. His jaw was set, but not with anger. She recognized something in his expression that she had not expected to see there. It was shame. She did not pursue it. She walked beside him in silence back toward the house, and she gave him the dignity of working through it himself. That evening, he appeared at dinner. They were dining together now, with the particular formality of 2 people navigating close quarters carefully, and he said, without preamble, "The night I sent you from the table. Last autumn." She kept her face composed. "Yes. It was a poor decision." The words were measured, as though he had practiced them to strip out any excess. "I did not consider, I treated the matter as though it were merely logistical." "You treated me as though I were merely logistical," she said, quietly. Not cruelly. Simply precisely. The silence that followed this was long enough that the candles flickered in some small movement of air, and the shadows shifted across the table between them. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at him then. She let herself look, really look, and what she found in his face was not the flat certainty of a man who considers himself always right, but something that had been working at him, she thought. from a depth she had not expected him to possess. She said, "Thank you for saying so, Your Grace." And she returned to her dinner. January brought 3 things of consequence: a letter from the neighboring lord, a late winter storm of unusual severity, and the night Eleanor found Sebastian Cavendish standing alone in the chapel at 2 in the morning. Lord Fenwick of the Haverstone estate had been nursing a long grievance about the boundary line between his property and Ashmore's eastern pastures. He arrived on a Tuesday, without appointment, in a mood that Eleanor assessed within 4 minutes as that of a man who had expected to find an absent duke and a manageable wife, and who was considerably wrong-footed to find them both present and united. She let Sebastian handle the initial conversation, watching from the edge of the room. But when Fenwick moved to produce a set of survey maps that she immediately recognized as altered, she had spent enough time with the estate records to know the correct boundary to within a few feet. She set down her teacup and said, "With perfect pleasantness, Lord Fenwick, you will want to compare those against the survey records from 1803. I had them copied last month. I can have them brought now." The silence in the room was comprehensive. Lord Fenwick departed an hour later without having achieved anything he had come for. At the door, Sebastian turned to look at her. Something moved in his expression that he controlled almost immediately, but not quite quickly enough. It looked, she thought, remarkably like admiration. She said, "He will likely try again in spring." "He will not find the situation any easier," Sebastian said. They looked at each other for a moment. Then she went back to the sitting room, and he went to the library, and neither of them said anything further about it for several days. But something had changed in the temperature between them, the way temperature in a room changes when someone has quietly built up the fire. The storm came at the end of January and lasted 3 days. On the second night, Eleanor woke to the sound of a child crying somewhere in the house, and in that moment of confused, startled awareness, she thought immediately of the Tennant families, of roofs and drainage and the coldest corner of Bessie Croft's cottage. She rose, wrapped herself in her warmest things, and went down. She found that the source of the sound was not in the house but reaching the house, thin and high, from across the snow-covered yard. One of the kitchen maids was standing at the back door, peering out into the dark, and said in a rush, "It's the Hewen boy, Your Grace, one of the grandchildren. He must have wandered from the old man's cottage. We don't know how long he's been out in it." Eleanor was outside before the sentence finished. The snow hit her face like ground glass. She followed the sound. She found the boy, no more than 4 years old, Thomas Hewen's youngest grandchild, who had apparently set out in the night to find a dog that had gone missing, in the shelter of the old stone wall at the edge of the yard, curled and shaking but alive. His coat inadequate by every measure. She picked him up. He was the weight of something that breaks your heart. She turned back toward the house and found Sebastian at her side. He had, apparently, heard the commotion from the library where he had been sitting up late and arrived moments after her. He took the child from her arms without a word, wrapped him in the heavy coat he'd come out without putting on properly, and carried him back to the house while Eleanor ran ahead to have the kitchen stoked and warm things prepared. The child recovered fully by morning. It was that night. In the kitchen in the small hours while the storm raged and the boy slept and Eleanor and Sebastian sat on either side of the fire with cups of tea they had made themselves, no servants awake. No ceremony, that she asked him, without planning to ask it, "What brought you back from the continent? You were there some years, before we married. The travel was not entirely voluntary, was it?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. The storm pressed against the windows. "I was at Waterloo," he said at last. "Not in a regiment. I was attached to a diplomatic party. But I was there in the aftermath." He stopped. His hands around the cup were very still. "The things that I witnessed, I found I could not be in the same room as noise, for a time. Gatherings. Crowds. Even the sound of a large dinner party. A pause that cost him something to maintain. I learned to manage it. But the management required distance." She looked at him across the fire. She understood, suddenly, a great many things that had seemed like cruelty and that had been, instead, a man holding himself together with both hands, keeping everyone far enough away that they could not see how hard he was gripping. She said, "The night you sent me from the dinner. The table of 40 people. The noise. He looked at the fire. I could not explain it. You could have tried, she said. But her voice was not hard. It was simply honest. Yes, he said. I could have tried. The fire burned. The storm rolled outside like a restless sea. Neither of them moved for a long time, and in that stillness, something that had been frozen between them very slowly began to thaw. February arrived and brought the letter no one had been waiting for. It came from London, sealed with the royal crest, and it summoned Sebastian to Parliament for an emergency session regarding the proposed reform legislation, a matter, the letter implied, of significant political urgency that would not brook delay. He was expected in London within the week. Eleanor received this news at breakfast. She read the expression on his face, not relief, as she might have expected from a man with an escape route, but reluctance, and said nothing immediately. He said, "The session will be several weeks. Possibly 2 months." She nodded. "The estate is in hand. There is nothing here that cannot be managed." "I know that," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not perfunctory, not dismissive, but weighted with an acknowledgement of precisely how thoroughly he knew it, that she felt under her ribs. Then he said, "There is a second matter." He set the letter down. "Fenwick has been making inquiries in London. He has suggested to certain parties that the Ashmore estate is in some financial disarray. He has produced a version of the boundary dispute that is flattering to himself. There is a solicitor involved." Eleanor was very still. "He wants the eastern pastures badly enough to pursue a legal case. He wants to force a settlement. He knows that a legal process, even one he cannot win, would be expensive and time-consuming." He looked at her. "I will address it in London. But I may need you to. I have already copied the relevant records," she said. "I will have a full account prepared for your solicitor by the end of the week." A pause. "I would also suggest that you speak to Thomas Hewen before you leave. He has worked those boundary fields for 50 years and his memory is precise. His testimony, if it came to that, would be considerable." He looked at her with the expression she had been seeing more frequently these past weeks, the expression of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation he thought he already understood. "Yes," he said. "I will speak to him." He left on Thursday. She stood on the front steps and watched the carriage go and was surprised to find that the feeling it produced in her was different from the one she had expected. Not relief at his absence. Something closer, if she was honest, to the quiet ache of his presence already receding. She went inside and got back to work. 3 weeks into his absence, the roof of the Croft cottage failed in a thawing freeze cycle that pulled away a substantial section near the chimney. Eleanor was there within 2 hours of being told. She arranged temporary accommodation for the Crofts at the house, a thing she did not have time to wonder about the propriety of. And would not have let stop her anyway, and had the repair begun within 4 days, coordinating 2 of the estate carpenters and a mason from the village who owed Martha Croft a long-standing favor. Martha Croft sat in the Ashmore Park kitchen on the 4th night of her family's temporary residence and said, with the directness of a woman who has decided to say the important thing before the moment passes, "You are not what we expected, Your Grace. When we heard the Duke had taken a wife, we thought, well, we have not always been well looked after here." Eleanor said, "I know. You didn't have to be different," Martha said. "Most in your position wouldn't have been." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. About the morning she had first walked into this woman's cottage and seen empty shelves and 3 small children and a woman apologizing for her poverty to a duchess. About every morning since. About a small carved wooden robin in her coat pocket. "I had to be different for myself," she said. The rest was just what followed. Sebastian returned in the 3rd week of March with the legal matter resolved, Fenwick's solicitor. Presented with the full documentary record and the prospect of a case built on fraudulent survey maps. Had retreated with the speed of a man whose client has stopped paying him, and with something in his bearing that was different from how he had left. He arrived in the late afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden. He found her there. He stood at the edge of the garden path and watched her for a moment before she heard his step and turned. His face, in the low spring light, was open in a way she had not seen before. The controlled precision had not left him, she did not think it ever would, fully, and she did not wish it to, but beneath it something had eased. He said, in London, at the session, Viscount Hargrove asked after you. He had heard, I am not certain how, these things travel, about the tenant work. The winter feeding. He paused. He said to me, your Duchess is the talk of Yorkshire. She looked at him steadily. I was only doing what needed doing. I know. He stepped forward. He stopped 2 feet from her. I have been thinking, these weeks away, of the night you found me in the chapel. He stopped. She had not forgotten it. She had mentioned it to no one. She waited. I go there sometimes when I cannot sleep. When London has been loud. He looked at the turned earth of the garden. I have done so for years and told no one. And then you were simply there, with a candle, and you did not ask me what was wrong. You only sat down beside me and waited until I was ready to come back inside. A pause. I did not thank you for that. She said, very quietly, you did not need to thank me. I need to thank you for a great many things, he said. And I find I am not practiced at it. No, she said. But you are learning. April brought the kind of days that feel like a statement, wide skies, warm earth, everything that had been frozen now moving again with purpose. Sebastian had begun what Eleanor privately thought of as his education. He rode out to the tenant farms himself, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, accompanied by the land agent from York, who had remained on a consulting basis and who had taken an approving view of the Duke once the Duke proved willing to be taught. He sat with old Thomas Hewen for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon. He came back from that visit quieter than usual, and at dinner he said, Hewen told me that you visit him every week. That you have done since September. He doesn't ask for much, Eleanor said. Mainly someone to listen. He told me he carved you a robin. He did. Sebastian looked at his plate and then at her. He said you keep it in your coat pocket. I do. He said nothing further. But he was looking at her with the expression she had come to think of as the truest one he had, the expression that appeared when his control was briefly and genuinely insufficient to cover what he was feeling. The night everything came clear between them was a quiet one, unremarkable on the surface. She had been sitting in the small sitting room she had made her own, the fire, her ledger, a book she was reading, the comfortable clutter of a life actively inhabited, when he knocked at the door. He did not simply enter. He knocked, and waited, and when she said come in, he stood in the doorway with his hands loosely at his sides, looking at the room. You have made this house into something, he said. He meant it as more than a statement about the furnishings, and they both knew it. She set her book down. She looked at him with the same steady clarity she had brought to everything, since the beginning. I have tried, she said. Eleanor. Her name in his voice. The first time, she thought, that he had used it as it was meant to be used, not as a label, not as a designation, but as a reaching toward. I sent you away from my table. In your own home. In front of my guests. He stopped. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was the seating arrangement. His jaw worked. I was afraid of being seen to need anything, including a wife, and I managed that fear by refusing to acknowledge that you existed at all. And you, he stopped again. You went and fed the people my own neglect had allowed to suffer. You repaired what I had left broken. You did it without my permission, without my knowledge, without my gratitude, without anything from me that might have made it reasonable or deserved. He was very still in the doorway. I need you to know that I understand what that means. What you are. She rose from her chair. She crossed the room to him, not quickly, deliberately, with the full weight of everything the last months had been, and stopped in front of him. She said, You are a man capable of change, Sebastian. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a rarer thing than most people know. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had seemed so cold the first time she had looked into them, and which she now understood had never been cold at all. Only held at tremendous cost from the heat beneath them. He said, I do not want to manage you into a convenient distance. I find I cannot do it any more. A pause, very quiet. I find I do not want to. Then don't, she said. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was careful. The grip of a man who handles what he values with the full seriousness of its worth. He stood like that for a moment, simply holding her hand in the firelit doorway of the room she had made into a home, and she let him. And outside the spring night was soft and the fields were alive again, and in the village a mile and a half away, the Crofts were warm and the Hewins were well, and Eleanor Ashmore, Duchess of Ashmore, stood in the center of everything she had quietly and persistently built, and she was no longer invisible. She was, very entirely, seen. In the morning, he rode with her to the village. He helped unload the bread. He held Bessie Croft up to see the new lamb in the far pasture. He stood beside old Thomas Hewin and listened to things he should have known years ago, and he listened with the full and sincere attention of a man who is not doing a duty, but is learning a home. At the edge of the field, on the walk back, he said, "I would like to ask your opinion about the east drainage situation." She said, "I thought you would never ask." He looked at her. She looked at him. And something began, properly and truly, from that moment, not the arrangement, not the ceremony, not the legal joining that had brought them to the same house, but the real thing. The quiet and lasting thing, which had been growing without either of them quite knowing it through all the long cold months of a woman feeding the hungry on her husband's land. And a man finally learning what it meant to come home. Eleanor Ashmore never forgot the night she was sent from her husband's table. Not because it wounded her, though it did, but because it was the night she understood that the most important work of her life would not be done in dining rooms, but in the world beyond them. In the cold and the mud and the early mornings. In the small, true, persistent acts of a woman who chose, again and again, to be present where she was needed most. And in the end, the Duke did not find a wife who had been waiting patiently for his approval. He found a woman who had rebuilt his world while he wasn't looking, and chose, with his whole heart, to belong to it. If this story moved you, please like and share it with someone who loves a romance earned the hard way. Subscribe for more beautiful, sweeping historical romances, and leave a comment below telling us whose journey touched you most, Eleanor's quiet strength, or the Duke's long way home.